So I would like to talk about a survey which I conducted many years ago in 1993 in high schools in New Zealand, Australia and Japan. I sent a written survey to all the high schools in New Zealand, to 500 high schools in Australia and 2,000 high schools in Japan, and asked the principals of the high school to give the survey to one biology teacher and one social studies teacher, social sciences teacher. And this was part of an effort in 1993 when I was trying to develop the field of descriptive bioethics by asking people around the world what is bioethics. And I did a public survey in 10 countries, but the initial high school survey was in 3 countries, and later I did in Singapore and also in Tamil Nadu in India. But the results are interesting. I will talk about this because in 1993 bioethics as a word was not in the curriculum, yet it is an ethical and social issues were thought about for at some time for people. So education of decision making is essential for future bioethical maturation of society, for a world where persons have increasingly more decisions to make. In all countries of the International Bioethics Survey, there is over 90% support for including discussion of social and ethical issues associated with science and technology in school, so that students can participate in contemporary debates. This is question 1E of the International Bioethics Survey. This chapter comes from a 500-page book I published called Bioethics for the People, by the People, in 1994. In a previous survey I just conducted in Japan in 1991, both with the students, teachers, medical doctors and the public, we looked at they found that there was a strong consensus for inclusion of discussion of ethical, social and environmental issues associated with genetic engineering in school and university curriculum, comparing to a survey which was just done in New Zealand.
Is bioethics part of the New Zealand curriculum?
Well, it is now, but in 1993 it was not formally part of the curriculum. So this comparative survey was done in 1993 to include Australia to initiate long-term research on the development of bioethics education in these 3 countries with the hope for further international cooperation. The questionnaire of 1991 was further developed in English and Japanese. Other areas of science and biotechnology were included, including animal experiments, in vitro fertilization and prenatal diagnosis. Questions on teaching materials were added, and the survey was extended to include social studies teachers, not only biology and science teachers. Some questions were used from the International Bioethics Survey in order to allow comparisons between the public and student views, and the results of these common questions are in the general data tables from the International Bioethics Survey. Results from some additional questions on teaching are used in this paper. The further analysis of the surveys and follow-up will be published later. And there will be published various papers in Journal of Moral Education, Journal of Biological Education, and other teaching journals, School Science Review, and so on. So the samples, we printed the questionnaires on 3 double-sided A4 sheets plus covering letters sent to high school principals. Return stamped address envelopes were included, and they were posted inside the countries. So I had returned postal addresses in each of these 3 countries. About 20 to 25% of schools in Japan The 1,500 were chosen, combining a random selection of the total high school list of the Ministry of Education and schools that replied to the survey of biology teachers in 1991. The surveys were sent in early July 1993. Reminders were sent to those schools that had not replied after 2 months, which increased the response rate about 5%. The response rate from biology teachers was 40%, which is not bad given the additional length of the questionnaire compared to the response of 45% in 1991. 88 biology teachers replied from the old schools, and 472 from new schools, and 61 social studies teachers who replied were from old schools. All the 334 high schools in New Zealand were sent questionnaires in August 1993, and those schools with more than 1,000 students were sent 4 questionnaires. In Australia, 500 schools, first selected from a list of schools available to foreign students and telephone books, were surveyed in August. A further 28 public schools were surveyed in November with the kind cooperation of the Australian Capital Territory Department of Education and Training, who sent an approval letter and a list of schools, which would help responses. But actually the response rate we would have thought was better, but it didn't help. So it actually was interesting that high schools, with an official letter from the Department of Education, didn't reply any more frequently to just the independent survey published from a university researcher, but I was. So possibly they thought the university researcher was independent and they appreciated that international aspect of it. Even though the same letter was in the survey, the ministry letter didn't help. And so also I used the telephone call as a reminder in South Australia, so trying to improve responses. So let's look at some of the school and teacher characteristics on page 187, table 1. The number of respondents and the response rate. So we had 55% of the schools a biology teacher replied in New Zealand, 48% of the schools in Australia, and 40% of schools in Japan. And less from social studies teachers, even though the principals were given one questionnaire for social studies and one for the biology teachers. It seems like it was of more interest to biology teachers. Particulars of urban and rural and so on. And the main subjects that the teachers taught. Of course, the social studies teachers are mainly social studies or geography, and the science teachers mainly biology and science, and there were a few agriculture teachers in schools in Australia, and one or two mathematics teachers. So the next section, teaching ethical, environmental and social issues, science is raised. So I'm going to look at this data table on page 189. So for high school teachers, additional questions on science and technology, and now in the Japanese case, J91 means the biology teachers from 1991 surveys. And one statement, scientists have left it mostly to others to communicate science to the public. Plus plus means strongly agree, and plus is agree. Here we find in New Zealand in 1990 and New Zealand in 1993, very similar results. 55% approve, I agreed with this, plus you strongly agree. Okay. If we look in Japan, however, we find in Japanese cases, in both 91 and 93, Japanese biology teachers did not agree with this statement. So that means that in Japan they believe scientists had been communicating to the public, whereas in New Zealand and Australia they had less support. Question 16K. Public understanding and awareness of science is generally poor. In New Zealand and Australia there was stronger approval for this statement. Next, scientists are obscure and unapproachable. This was not, in a sense, not the most common view. More teachers disapproved, didn't agree with this view, which means probably they thought scientists are not so obscure and they are approachable. Inst was the first one on inclusion of genetic engineering and its applications should be taught as a topic in the school biology syllabus. Strongly agree in New Zealand. The first one is 1990, next 1993, and then from social studies teachers. Interestingly, the biology teachers, which is these first two columns, more strongly agreed that genetic engineering should be taught in the school biology syllabus than the social studies teachers. Okay. And I should note that following the surveys in the mid-1990s, genetic engineering has been and remains a compulsory part of the school biology curriculum, as does the teaching of its social and ethical and environmental issues, and it's one of the questions in the final biology exam for university entrance is on social and ethical issues, and usually they have to choose social and ethical issues of genetic engineering or social and ethical issues of organic farming. Or biological pest control, one of these applications. So it's taught for a long time in the New Zealand curriculum and in the Australian curriculum, and to less degree in Japan. But actually, discussion of the issues involved in science and technology, there was approval of this in all countries. But the strongly approved, these two are in New Zealand, these two are in Australia, is significantly more than in Japan. The next set of questions is a question, it's question 6 in table 3, page 190. How do we compare the teaching of subjects in bioethics, science and technology in Australia, Japan and New Zealand? And for each question there was, can you tell me how much you've heard about each of these subjects? Not heard of it, no. Could explain to a friend, explain. Have you taught in class, teach, yes. Okay. So, in the case of, in New Zealand, biology teachers could explain pesticides, and they had taught it, 88% had taught about pesticides, 84% had talked about in vitro fertilization, 72% had talked about prenatal diagnosis, 96% had talked about biological pest control, because that was actually part of the curriculum, because in New Zealand it was already a very important subject. Eugenics, only 36%, computers, 61%, biotech, 78%, nuclear power, 82%, AIDS, 94%, human gene therapy, 66%, fiber optics, bioethics, 67%, 88% on genetic engineering of plants, 81% genetic engineering of microorganisms, and 81% genetic engineering of animals. The bioethics is interesting because it was not in the curriculum. Okay. In 1993 it was not in the curriculum, but 67% of biology teachers and 22% of social studies teachers in New Zealand said they taught about it. In the third and fourth column it's the Australian biology and social studies teachers. And then for the Japanese case, the biology teachers and the social studies teachers, it was not in the curriculum, but still 45% or 39% said they talked about it. So what this is interesting in terms of how strictly do teachers talk about subjects that are thought to be socially relevant by many people, both the public and teachers, but are not yet in the curriculum. But they're still using it to teach science, because if they make the science interesting, they will talk. And gradually in all countries there was a repository of newspaper articles and in many popular science magazines such as New Scientist and Nature. There are many bioethics subjects in this time. But to give you the context, in the first paper I published in the journal Nature in 1992, using the word bioethics, the Nature editors changed the word to biological ethics. But subsequently, after the 1992 and onwards, we start to see them accepting the word bioethics. When I published it was a lead commentary in the Nature in 1992, they used the term, they changed my bioethics to biological ethics. I was talking about Japan and the title was the Far East of Biological Ethics, when in fact it was actually about bioethics. I was talking about genes and brain death and other things. This term had not become familiar, but gradually, as we saw, teachers at the same time in 1993 were talking about these subjects. So that was an interesting aspect and a stimulus for the development of the international bioethics education networks and programs which I did. And it also meant it was easier to work with ministries of education to introduce bioethics into the curriculum. So the results of these surveys were sent to every high school principal in all three countries. In Japan there were 5,000 plus schools we sent letters and materials to, with a grant from the Ministry of Education, to say, well, here are materials on bioethics and here's the results. And this was a way to gradually get the bioethics in the schools. My motivation was that every citizen should make bioethical decisions. So when I've had some discussions, for example, Suma's asked me, is bioethics, she says, not in the curriculum. Well, actually, when we look back in the 1990s on the development and inclusion of bioethics in the curriculum, at first teachers started to teach because of different forces, and one was the STS approach to science education, science, technology, society approach in the 1960s and 70s found that if you teach about the social issues of science or some technology to students, they're going to be better at their science. And it was an interesting that bioethics could follow this. Now, I want to read Table 4 and then come back to some other topics. Table 4 on page 192. The comparative teaching of ethical and social and environmental issues. Is question 9. Have you ever discussed in class the social, ethical and environmental issues associated with applications of these scientific developments? So as you go through the interview or survey, in this case, because some people may not have been understanding the questions, I want to repeat this question using a more directive form next. So question 9, have you discussed? And then question 10, do you think more room should be made in the curriculum for discussion of the issues associated with applications of these scientific developments? So you can see the rationale for why I did these surveys in these countries was to work for getting evidence on bioethics and social issues, and then to present to the ministries of education in each of these countries, which we did. And so on in vitro fertilization, in the New Zealand it's table 4, biology teachers, 77% said they taught about the social and ethical or environmental issues of IVF, which means social ethical issues. Only 38% of the social studies teachers said they talked about that. So it's interesting that the biology teachers, they may well be talking about in vitro fertilization as part of their science, and therefore raise the social ethical issues, which is fairly common. The Australian biology teachers, more of them had, and partly this was, we could see in the curriculum in some states, in fact at this time, South Australia already had it compulsory in the biology curriculum to talk about social issues of some biological issues in 1990. So it was in the curriculum in South Australia, but it was not yet in some of the other states. So already 87% had said they, and 50% thought there should be more, because already they knew there's some there. But in Japan, also half of the teachers had said they talked about it. Yeah, as a control, the environmental issues of in vitro fertilization, there's not too many. I mean, population explosion by increased fertility is an issue which we had in our Skype class a few weeks ago. Social issues of prenatal diagnosis, biotechnology, nuclear power, pesticides, genetic engineering. So that provides us some of these issues. There was also a topic here for other topics, and some of the other topics may be interesting here. This is at the bottom of page 191. So I had a space for other topics that they had talked about, and Japanese teachers were also asked about the teaching of Barakimin problems. And so there's a large class of people in Japan who are outcasts, still facing discrimination. And 45% of biology teachers and 86% of social teachers said they discussed this in class. 91% of social teachers said they could explain it, 9% had heard it, but 66% of biology teachers said they could explain, and 32% said they'd only heard of it. So actually I included Barakimin in the Japanese teacher surveys. Now, I think if I used another term, Barakimin, or Hinen means non-person, is similar to untouchable. Okay, it means untouchable people. And they usually have similar family occupations. They're dealing with killing animals, leather work, dealing with dead bodies, undertakers. So they're spiritually unclean. But it's a very serious discrimination. So the same if you have an arranged marriage in India, you will check the caste and you may not be happy if your son or daughter is going to marry an untouchable. The same in Japan. People in many traditional areas at least will look at the family history and make sure that you're not Barakimin or untouchable.
In another tradition, to bathe the bodies of the dead is considered a sacrament.
Yes. In which tradition?
In the Jewish tradition, it's considered, that's like a rabbi's, a special kind of I had a friend who was Sufi and a professor. He was actually dean at Graduate Theological Union in the Unitarian, and was also very involved with one of the synagogues up in the Berkeley area, and that was one of the things that he did, was to bathe the bodies of the deceased, and he was highly honored in the community because of it. It was like a sort of rabbinical sacrament to do for the family.
That's an interesting point. What about Brahmin priests? Do they touch dead bodies or not?
They touch whose bodies?
Dead bodies.
Dead bodies. I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No. Because they only do the rituals.
But they don't touch the bodies.
The family does that in the Hindu tradition. Yeah, usually a close family member, I think, does that. A child, if they have children who are alive, or the spouse.
And what about in the Shinto tradition? Do Shinto priests, well, usually it's a Buddhist funeral, as you said, but do the Buddhist priests touch the body? I don't think so. It's usually the undertakers or the funeral staff do that, yeah?
Never touch it.
I mean, the priests don't touch. Yeah.
Funeral company.
Funeral company.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the funeral company employees in the past were usually a type, do you want to marry a funeral director? It was a different class, yeah. Now they might become very rich because death is actually a big business. So it's not an economic issue, but it's a spiritual cleanliness.
Like the butcher.
What about in Islam? Do you have a separate
We don't
people?
have any caste. In Islam, everyone is equal. So everyone can touch the dead body, and everyone comes to pray for the dead body for their better afterlife.
Touching with your bioethics, it's really interesting because sociology of science is a very well-established old field.
Yeah.
So sociology and the philosophy of science, this is like 100 years old more,
Yeah.
the idea. And speaking in those terms it is, but bioethics, even when I came to America returned to America in 2006, 2007, and I had this impulse, go and do bioethics, and I'm like, what's bioethics?
Yeah.
And I think in America at that time in the US, there were only 2 or 3 master's programs in the whole country. And now there are more than 300.
Yep.
It's like most major universities now have bioethics centers. Columbia has 7 different master's programs in bioethics. But all of this came about in the last 10 years.
Yes.
The field of the burgeoning of the word bioethics and the meaning of it. And I think it's really symptomatic of ethics catching up with technology.
Yeah. Yes, it's an interesting phenomenon.
And also higher order thinking skills, which has become a very big part of STEM education in science and technology. Because of HOTS, or higher order thinking, has become a very important program which is based on Bloom's taxonomy. And Bloom's taxonomy is now a part of children's assessment in class. The teachers have to analyze higher order thinking skills. Because of this particular program, now many people are thinking about the bioethical issues as well. And I think STEM education, if you look into it, science and technology, it has become a very big program where it's also a kind of elitism where people want to know what science and technology is, and also the latest discoveries or inventions, or how to use this program as part of school's curriculum. But I think it's actually a blessing now, because on one hand I was thinking science and technology, are we going far ahead then? Looking at the preventive measures of what disasters can happen later. But if you look now, we have to bring in the real issues.
Yeah.
So the issues actually come in because of this program. Yeah?
It would be interesting with this whole movement in STEM, which has now become STEAM, integrated the arts, in STEAM, and then to add the bioethics to it would be really the social implications that it should be part of it, and I think it sort of is, because these children are growing up in this environment.
Yeah. Yes, no, it should be, and that's why the STS movement is quite relevant. I wrote quite a lot about it in the 1990s, because I saw this as a way. But what this survey shows in 1993 is that teachers were doing it. So they may be using different words.
Yeah, different words, but I think, I don't know about India. I remember reading Dr. Jayapal's papers,
Yes.
some of your books, and I remember reading some of the surveys that he did. And there was one person, I think his name was Dr. Banerjee or something like that, who actually said that environmental education was hardly taught in India for many years, until recently.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It wasn't seen that before high school it was like a root sort of thing, and then only when the children are, so really a lot I think also depended on the teacher, the individual teacher.
So I'd like to go next to page 194 to the animal experiments as an example of an issue. And in fact, it relates a bit to what we talked about earlier. So the number of animal experiments may vary widely in different situations in schools, with some saying that they don't do experiments, while others saying strongly that they need experiments. This was the most sensitive issue in the questionnaire for some teachers, and the results are interesting. In question 18, the reasons that are against experiments include no need for animals or don't use them. Some teachers, especially in New Zealand, expressed concern about student abuse of animals and disrespect for life. Many social teachers expressed don't know to the existence of guidelines in the school without an answer, while others said yes, but they didn't know what the guidelines included. And one Australian teacher returned the questionnaire with a copy of the South Australian State Code of Practice for the use and care of animals in schools, in addition to their comments. So also in the book, if you look, there's a lot of comments about what bioethics is for the teachers. I listed all, it was an open question, what's bioethics? And you can find all these open comments in the book as well. Another way to measure is to ask students how they feel, which is another important method. In the experience of one of the co-authors of this project, at Tokyo Wildlife College, 145 students in their first year biology course were asked how they felt about mouse dissections. In these classes, one mouse was used for 24 students who were in training to be involved in animal nursing or keeping animals. There were 84% women, and this was the first and only animal experiment in the first year course. They had the option not to join in, but all did so. A short questionnaire of the course, including several open questions on the issues made. The open comments included 11% said they had a bad feeling, 4% said they were sorry, 4% felt it was like a human or wondered why it was needed, 4% said they could feel there, 35% said it's interesting, 13% that I hope that it will do it again, 9% said it's great, and a variety of other comments ranging from it, the same as cooking, to they wanted to say thank you. Now it's interesting because in the context of the Japanese case, there's almost no vegetarians. So it's very interesting for the questions of the people here.
When I was I must have been about 12. And I remember, before I was a vegetarian, but I remember they fed at a camp, maybe I was younger, they fed a mouse to a snake, and of course I went in and snuck the snake out of snuck the mouse out of the snake's cage so that would be saved, kept it in my cabin for a couple of days, and
And the cat got it.
let it go. But then they had to explain to me that the snake also had to eat.
Okay.
But it was rather traumatic.
Yes, it is traumatic if you want to see, but it's interesting because very few vegetarians yet people were expressing opinions about the care for animal experiments because they don't see the dead body, they see the supermarket piece of meat and then they don't know.
Don't live in that world.
Animal experiments. So a summary on table 6 on page 195. Do you use animals in class? Biology teachers, 90% in New Zealand, 71 in Australia, 69 in Japan. Do you need it to teach biology? In New Zealand the consensus was yes, 93%. In Australia 67%, in Japan 85%. Even though that's more than the number of teachers in Japan. So maybe some of the biology teachers in Japan had felt a little bit they couldn't teach. Have you ever had ethical concerns about using animals? Have students ever said they have ethical concerns about using animals? In every case in New Zealand, you can see more students. In Australia the biology teachers, yes, more students, but for the Japanese teachers, less students and more of themselves had said they had some reasons, ethical concerns. And the types of reasons were open comments, and then I put them into categories. No need for animals, don't use them, cosmetic testing is bad, we get dead animals only, invertebrates only, dissections only, use a small number, don't like to hurt them, we use them humanely. We have a debate on animal rights in class. We return to nature after use. So these are live experiments, observational experiments. Students abuse the animals, happened in New Zealand, and we need experiments from it. So these are some of the comments. And question 20, at your school, are there any guidelines about using animals in classes? So national guidelines were expressed in the New Zealand case and the Australian case, but not in Japan. In Japan, they used a small number, or they used humane use and respect, but they didn't mention guidelines. The next section was some questions on information and teaching resources, where we get information on bioethics, so that's where in response, a lot of teachers said they wanted more information. In page 198 on table 7, teaching resources, we can see, do you have sufficient material to teach about these issues? The answer was no. In fact, in Japan, 3% of the biology teachers and 14% of social studies teachers said they had. And even in Australia, where it was in South Australia compulsory, and in others it was still quite popular, they didn't have enough. So that was another motivation why I submitted to get more grants from the Ministry of Education in Japan to develop teaching materials, because we had the national data and we could get some support for development of teaching materials. And this program continued from 1993. 1996 we had the teaching materials to every school in Japan, and then the cross-cultural introduction to bioethics was released in 2004 after many trials in different countries, and that's the open source material that I still use, and we have it in about 10 languages, so it's available for people in different countries.
And it's called
Cross-Cultural Introduction to Bioethics, and the first edition was called Bioethics Across Cultures in 2003, and I abbreviated CCIB.
And you created it with your colleagues?
Yeah, I created it with the colleagues. The first one was in 1996, and gradually developed materials So by 2004, it was most of the current
Have you
edition.
interfaced at all with the people developing the bioethics curriculum in Italy connected with the Amans group?
Well, we did, yes, and then in fact we also on the website integrated the UNESCO core curriculum, and in fact we were involved in the discussion of the curriculum.
So it's evolving
So
still.
and we have case studies and matching things. So it's been available on the UNESCO platform for 10 years, or 15 years, and the Bioethics platform for many years. So,
Are these the contents that you're referring to belong to the yellow book?
the yellow book
And-
and developed,
the
into
two
the
books.
iBook. So we have a yellow book. Yes.
Bioethics in Asia, I think you have one.
Bioethics in Asia is an academic book, but the yellow book, the big one, Cross-Cultural Introduction to Bioethics, we printed maybe 20,000 copies of this book around the world, and other license for people to copy their own and print their own. It's available in many languages. So
I was thinking that one book can produce so many more lessons, and also
yeah, yes. So it's available, and it's an iBook as well, interactive. So then this survey was the basis of this work in bioethics education that's been ongoing, and developing an action plan, developing materials, developing networks, now developing degrees to get people qualified to train teachers to teach bioethics. So that's the goal of AUSN and the Eubios programs. So every citizen in the world should talk about bioethics, should be able to make decisions, and we have second or third generation of people now because we started in the 1990s. So that was this is sort of a step back in history to see how this was used. I mentioned at the bottom of page 299 the use of an STS approach to teach science would make it easier to teach bioethics and actually teach data more effectively. The use of animals may need to be reassessed given modern alternatives. Videos and attitudes to the issue have been surveyed before among students. Environmental education is already supplied with civil books. There are environmental education source books in the Australian Curriculum Development Centre and so on. So this is from this 1994 summary of the 1993 book, and how this described what we were doing and the reasons for that.
is the school curriculum still using STS as an important part of their social science, or has the name changed?
Well, the names made many different names because there was a decade of education for sustainable development, which was big, well-funded, and values education, and yeah. So there are many different names for it. Yes. So that's why we have to see. That's why teaching of ethical, social, environmental issues is a neutral way to ask people. So that's a background of this development in bioethics education, of the strategy that was used. So the evidence was there. We got that evidence in other countries and worked with ministries of education. So following that, I worked with ministers of education to organize a ministerial meeting. We had all the ministers of education come together in ministries in Asia Pacific on philosophy education, so that's also bioethics, and other aspects. And every country says it's doing. Many in Asia Pacific say they're doing it from preschool, primary school. So it's a matter of how do we integrate. So
Certainly in the Bay Area, and I guess worldwide, there's this movement toward EQ education, which is
emotional
and social, rather than just IQ.
Yeah.
Emotional and social learning.
Yes,
Intelligence.
So see, for me, it's all bioethics, but it could be all inquiry-based learning. It could all be critical thinking,
problem solving.
Yeah, all of these are words that we can use. So,
I'm just thinking, can this also be a big part of spiritual education? Because everything, as you think more deeply into bioethics, it's bringing the spirit of the life itself. And today spirituality is connected to religion and not to life and the processes that we are involving ourselves with.
well, I think actually in the Australian case, what was interesting is in the 1990s, one of the reasons that bioethics was starting to be adopted more was because of some objections to religious education. The teachers knew that you needed to teach values, and so a new name for religion could be bioethics, because it sounds technical, but it's actually values. So it provides that context. But actually in many Catholic schools in Australia, which were Catholic schools, or many private schools in Australia were Catholic, they had both. But for many secular schools, philosophy education is introduced as an alternative to critical thinking, philosophy with kids. These were different ways. Because in some countries, religion is not so good to be, they don't want to be taught. So for example, in Japan, if you told a science teacher they have to teach religious education, they will not like that. But they're going to say, well, we have a home class, we're going to have a health class, we're going to have a bioethics class, we're going to have an ethics class, we're going to have social studies. Then they use different terms. But actually they're fulfilling this moral questions that people have. But there is one difference between ethics teaching is critical thinking. That you have a dilemma and you may not have a fixed answer, whereas in some religions you do have a fixed answer. That you should follow what it says according to the Pope's teaching, or according to this fatwa, or according to this scripture you should teach. So that's that is a difference between it. That's why bioethics and critical thinking is closer than religious education. But actually some religious teachers also taught about the balancing principles. It depends on the religious conditions.
What about removing the religious part of it and only using the spiritual aspect of it, where you look at life forms and how they form, and what she spoke about, all those things when you bring in without the religious aspect, won't people see the flow of life in bioethics itself?
They may, yeah. It's but again, for in some countries, spiritual, if it's done, like some objections about mindfulness is quite useful, quite a popular trend. But when you mention meditation, some Christian schools or some Islamic schools will say that's Buddhism and we're not going to do it. But actually it's not. It's more universal. And there are meditation traditions in Islam or Christianity or Buddhism or Judaism or every religion. We have to, fundamentalism is probably the problem with this.
Unless we bring some new name to it, instead of the word meditation.
Mindfulness and bioethics.
Well, mindfulness, in fact, we have published a book on mindfulness. We tried it with the Apache tribe. So, mindfulness. Would anybody on Skype like to ask any questions? Any of our Skype colleagues? No questions, Leandro, Manuel, Reti's doing any others?
It is 5:30 there.
Okay, so I hope then we can have a conclusion.
Yes.
But bioethics education is needed everywhere. So that's the conclusion. Many people helped in this work, and fortunately many of them are still working in bioethics education. Okay, so thank you to everyone.